Egypt is the gift of the Nile, Herodotus. It's hard to name a country defined more by one geographic entity than Egypt, and it's even harder to name a country whose landmass and civilizations have been so ingrained into the collective consciousness of people around the globe. This video, however, will not be discussing pyramids, pharaohs, or cat worship, but rather the geopolitics of the modern nation-state of Egypt. With this large population and economy, along with the soft power stemming from its incredibly old and rich history and modern culture, Egypt is one of the most iconic nations on Earth, even in modern times. But it's racked with serious internal and external challenges. This video will assess whether or not Egypt has the potential to become a great power. Let's start off with geography. Almost all of Egypt is composed of deserts. This arid desert wasteland is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because it's turned Egypt into an isolated fortress, protected by a hard-to-traverse set of deserts, making it almost impossible for invading forces from various ancient North African warbands to even the Germans during World War II. This is not to say that Egypt has never been conquered. It used to be subjugated by the Nubians from the south in antiquity, but more oftentimes than not, various empires from the east and the Mediterranean to the north, it was by and large pretty easy to defend. For the most part, Egypt has maintained security, in part due to the vast deserts and even more due so to the protection and natural resources that the Nile offers. No other country is more well defined by one body of fresh water. Nearly all of the country's population straddles the Nile. Without the Nile, there would be no Egypt. Without Egypt, there would be no ancient civilization, no modern civilization. Nearly all of the population lives along the Nile, as does the nation's logistical lines, food production, and nearly all of its institutions, with the exception of the Afro-Saint Suez Canal. At the mouth of the Nile, along the Mediterranean, you have, well, the city of Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great, and it operates as one of the nation's major gateways to other marine ports. Just south of that delta is the famed city of, you guessed it, Cairo. A city dating back to more recent times, namely the Middle Ages. It's Egypt, so it's relatively recent. Cairo is not only the capital, but also the largest city, and home to the nation's modern economy, as well as its political and cultural institutions. However, that may change soon. The population of the nation is highly concentrated in this area, and it's also pretty close to the pyramid, so check it out. Further south, the Nile produces some of the best farmland in the country. It's predictable, nutrient-rich soil, and great for irrigation. Barley, chickpeas, wheat, and other foods have produced a massive population that can feed a massive city like Cairo, along with cotton and other commodities. However, the Nile does have its drawbacks. Unlike, say, the Mississippi River, the Nile River is pretty bad for navigation due to cataracts and shallow whitewater rapids. This means that logistics must also include land transportation across each side of the Nile. This adds a great deal to government costs. This is part of the reason why, south of Aswan, there really aren't any major Egyptian settlements worth mentioning. The Nile also flows as far south as Lake Victoria around Tanzania and Uganda. You know, the part of Africa with zebras, not camels. That's how long the Nile is. And Egypt is right at the tail end of the mighty river. Being a downstream nation leads to inherent vulnerabilities. Unlike the Mississippi River, which is fully located within the United States, the Egyptian Nile's waters are dependent on flows from its southern neighbors, namely Sudan and Ethiopia. To the east lies the Sinai Peninsula. You may have heard this place from the Bible. It's the one part of Egypt that's in Asia. It's an arid land, and unlike much of the other desert regions, it's very mountainous. This provides a buffer with Israel. But its rough terrain also makes it a pretty trendy location for criminals and insurgent groups. This area also has the Suez Canal, connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. The passage is arguably the most important man-made waterway in the world, only perhaps rivaled by the Suez Canal. This gives Egypt an enormous geopolitical leverage on the world stage, along with a great deal of revenue. In recent years, there have even been plans to build a new capital, largely built by the developers connected to Egypt's military. Part of this would aid the congestion in Cairo. However, newly built capitals have a pretty poor track record. After all, it was Britain's former colonial control over Egypt that ended in 1922 that led to this conundrum. However, the Brits continued to meddle in Egyptian affairs as Egypt was a major chess piece during World War II due to the Nile Delta and Suez Canal. The Italians failed to capture Egypt, and the Germans came closer but nonetheless failed. Many Egyptians saw Rommel, the leader of the Germans during World War II, as a hero against British imperialism, and after World War II, Egypt would become embroiled in the First Arab-Israeli War, in which Egypt and other Arab allies would fail to defeat Israel or develop a Palestinian state. The feckless monarchy of Egypt would eventually be overthrown by military officers. One of the most central figures to rise up would be Gamal Nasser, the most important influential political figure in the Arab world during the mid-20th century. Nasser was a pan-Arab nationalist who resented European imperialism and colonialism. He set himself up not only as a leader of Egypt, but as a thought leader in the Arab world at large. And, for that matter, the Third World in general. Pan-Arabism emerged as nationalism swept through much of the developing world, as various nations threw off the yoke of European exploitation. Former European colonism had ended, but the Arab world was still a collection of arbitrarily drawn-off borders. The last remnants of British imperialism ended in 1956, when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. This infuriated Britain and France, which alongside Israel invaded Egypt. As a response to this form of neo-imperialism, the Soviet Union threatened Britain and France, prompting the US President Eisenhower to demand all three countries leave Egypt. This was groundbreaking. For one, Britain and France finally realized that they were second-rate powers compared to the US and Soviet Union. Secondly, Israel began to shift its attention away from Britain and towards the United States. After all, Britain was no longer the mighty power it once was. The third factor was that Nasser became a hero across the Arab world, seeing him as an icon against European imperialism. However, this glory would not last. Nasser's United Arab Republic with Syria was short-lived, and any hope for Arab unification never came to fruition. Israel continued to exist, and Nasser was unable to formally unite with any other Arab states in the long run. Nasser also turned Egypt into a police state and crushed dissent and trampled on human rights. Meanwhile, there was another threat to Pan-Arabism, one from within. Despite being Muslim, Nasser was secular as a politician, and he hated Islamic fundamentalists, and had a great deal of distrust towards Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. The final years of Nasser's life were a long drag, hampered by defeats until he died of a heart attack. He was eventually replaced by Anwar Sadat, who had departed from many of Nasser's policies and brought Egypt into the American sphere of influence as he made peace with Israel, which eventually got him assassinated. He was also, however, an autocrat, so just keep that in mind. Egypt also was temporarily kicked out of the Arab League for the peace treaty. The next major player after Sadat was assassinated would be Mubarak, another military strongman who ensured economic stability, but was also mired in corruption scandals, being ousted of power during the Arab Spring and later imprisoned after a court sentencing, but then freed later and then died in 2020. The aftermath of the Arab Spring has been a giant convoluted mess. The Muslim Brotherhood eventually won an election despite the secular military establishment's hatred for political Islam, and lo and behold, the military ousted them as well. Today, the leader of Egypt is General el-sisi. Over the years, Egypt has become far more conservative and religious than it had been during the mid-20th century, despite the wishes of military officials, women's rights groups, and religious minorities like the Coptic Orthodox Christians. While this has happened, the center of geopolitical gravity in the Arab world had shifted away from Egypt and towards Saudi Arabia. Moving on to the economy. Egypt's most important industries are related to oil and gas. Granted, hydrocarbon resources in Egypt are nowhere near as central to the nation's economy as they are in the Gulf states. Egypt is also a major agro-power due to the rich soil deposits of the Nile. In recent years, much of the farmland has been used less for food and more for cotton. Egyptian cotton is some of the best in the world and is highly lucrative. However, this has also placed stress on the country's food security. And right now, Egypt is importing vast amounts of wheat and other grain, as Egyptians are some of the heaviest consumers of bread. This carb-heavy diet is also a result of economic hardship, as many Egyptians face a nation that continues to be mired in poverty and unemployment. Egypt has also had a large service economy tied to its tourism industry. All that money spent on the pyramids thousands of years ago has paid off big time. One of the most bizarre aspects of Egypt's economy is the extent to which almost everything is controlled in part by the military, from imports, exports, finance, and manufacturing. The military has its fingerprints in almost everything: the management of seaports, the production of kitchen appliances like toaster ovens. The military industries are not transparent and are not taxed. As one can imagine, this black box brings in some serious questions. Furthermore, the military has giant subsidies to companies that it has deep ties with. It also has a strong grip on the country's raw materials. This military control over the economy tends to deter foreign investment in the private sector and healthy competition. Nonetheless, Egypt is still a middle-income country with far higher standard of living than most African nations. Speaking of the military, Egypt is currently considered a military dictatorship. The Nile has always made it easy for a central strong figure to seize control of the entire country, from pharaohs to the modern day. Granted, authoritarianism in Egypt, while far from democratic, is still far less draconian than restrictions found in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Syria, and other Middle Eastern nations. Egypt has also been relatively stable compared to that of most of its neighbors, as government protests and turmoil do occur, and sometimes get bloody. However, they've never devolved into a full-scale civil war in recent memory. Egypt has also been a target of terrorism, however, it's managed to keep most of the militant groups down far better than, say, Syria, Iraq, and others. The Egyptian secular military government has oftentimes tended to use the threat of terrorism to rationalize a strong armed opposition to full-fledged civil liberties. As stated before, the military has had its hands in nearly every pot of honey, and unsurprisingly, bribes, nepotism, and shady deals are the norm. The military has also had strong investment in telecommunications and a hardline grip on the media. Despite the central control of the military and the vast amount of power it assumes within the country on foreign soil, the Egyptian military is actually pretty weak. And that brings us to our next subject: foreign affairs. Egypt maintains its position as the de facto soft power in the Arab world due to its large population, as well as its contributions to cinema, music, sports, and others. However, much of the Arab hard power has shifted towards Saudi Arabia, with Saudi Arabia outshining Egypt as the dominant political force in the Middle East. It is no longer secular pan-Arab nationalism, but rather political Islam that has become the dominant ideology. Nasser's ideology at this point is dead in the water, and most power players in Egypt aren't particularly fond of it either. Egypt has nonetheless maintained fairly close relations with other Arab nations, and fairly poor relations with Iran. Egypt has also had growing concerns over Turkish naval posturing in the eastern Mediterranean, and some have speculated that Turkey may even interfere militarily with the Nile. Even though Egypt has made formal relations with Israel during the 1970s, most Egyptians are strongly anti-Zionist and sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. The Egyptian military continues its formal diplomatic ties with Israel despite the distaste of the general public. Much of the Egyptian populace view the West with suspicion as well, but this has not stopped the military generals from maintaining close ties to Western nations, especially the United States of America. Egypt is one of the top 5 countries receiving US foreign aid due to its control of the Suez Canal, its oil, and its military support, as well as continuing the peace with Israel. Egypt has also expressed support for the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, but is vehemently against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, which it shares a border with in the Sinai Peninsula. Gaza is walled off both on the Egyptian and Israeli sides, essentially making it a large open-air prison. This border was once mired in illegal smuggling, which Egyptian authorities have not been able to control until relatively recently due to the recent conflict. To the south lies Sudan, followed by Ethiopia. Now, Ethiopia plans on finishing off the construction of a dam that would provide their people with abundant energy, but would also cut off water supplies to Egypt. Well, not completely, but at least greatly diminish it, leading to catastrophic consequences for Egyptian water security and agriculture. This is only made worse with climate change, causing seawater to move further and further into the Nile Delta. There's a possibility that Egypt will even declare war on Ethiopia over dam constructions, or perhaps start a development authority for upstream and downstream cooperation peacefully. Only time will tell. This issue is only exacerbated by the fact that Ethiopia is a close ally of China and Egypt is a close ally of the US. It is clear that Egypt's regional power is fading in relation to others. Nonetheless, the Suez Canal will mean that most countries, be it the US, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and others, will still try their best to be on good terms with Egypt. Egypt's relative power on the world stage is probably set to decline, but Egypt itself, the gift of the Nile, has proven to be resilient. Its unique geography and rich past has stood longer than virtually that of any modern nation on the state of the planet. Egypt will almost certainly not become a great power on the world stage. However, it will continue to be a regional power, and the narrative surrounding its past and present will last the test of time. Thanks for watching.